The Chinese millionaire hid his fortune and sought shelter in a single mother's home. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. The sun was setting on the horizon of Chicago, casting a golden glow over the skyscrapers of the financial district. From his office atop a luxury building on Michigan Avenue, Richard Anderson observed the city with a distant gaze. At 45, he had built an empire in the American financial market, becoming one of the most powerful and envied men in the country. His face, which frequently graced business magazines and social columns, was now marked by deep shadows under his eyes and an expression of defeat. "Mr. Anderson, is everything confirmed for tomorrow's press conference?" asked his assistant Martha as she entered the room with a folder of documents. "Cancel everything," he replied dryly, without shifting his gaze from the window. "There will be no conference." Martha hesitated, confused. "But, sir, the investors are demanding explanations about the accusations. The public relations department thinks it's better to face this head-on and—" "I said cancel it!" Richard turned abruptly, slamming his fist on the glass desk. Seeing Martha's frightened look, he sighed deeply. "I'm sorry, please, just cancel everything." When he was alone again, Richard opened his desk drawer and took out a brown envelope. Inside was a passport with a false name, some bundles of cash, and a disposable phone. The contingency plan he never imagined he would need to use. The financial scandal had broken the previous week. A scheme involving insider trading at Anderson Investments had been revealed by an anonymous whistleblower. Although Richard knew that the complaint came from his former partner, Edward Matthews, he had no way to prove it. Edward, feeling betrayed after Richard pushed him out of the business, had orchestrated his downfall with surgical precision. In a matter of days, the company's stocks plummeted, investors fled, and the FBI began investigating. Richard knew it. It was only a matter of time before he was formally accused. But what scared him most wasn't the possible legal consequences, but the threats he had begun to receive. Edward had dangerous connections, and the messages made it clear that his safety was at risk. That night, Richard Anderson disappeared. Without saying goodbye to anyone, taking hardly anything beyond a backpack with some clothes, fake documents, and money, he left behind his penthouse apartment, his luxury cars, and the entire life he had built. The next day's headlines speculated about his whereabouts, some suggesting he had fled the country, others that he was hiding in one of his properties abroad. No one would have imagined that he would be on a bus headed to Bayshore, a historic coastal town between New York and Boston. Julia Martin wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished arranging the tables in the small inn she managed in Bayshore's historic district. At 38, her face carried the striking beauty of a strong woman with features that blended her African-American mother's heritage and her father's European ancestry. Her curly hair was tied in an improvised bun, and her hands, though delicate, showed signs of constant work. "Mom," Tina called. "Saying she can't come to work today again," said Michael, her 15-year-old son, entering the breakfast room. The teenager was tall for his age, with the same almond-shaped eyes as his mother. Julia sighed, feeling the weight of another problem to solve. "That's the third time this month, and today of all days when we have guests arriving." "I can help." "After school," the boy offered. "No, son, you need to study, and your sister?" "Beth is finishing a school assignment. She said she'll come down in 10 minutes to help you." Julia's life hadn't been easy since she found herself alone raising 2 children. The children's father, a local tour guide whom she had married young, abandoned the family when Michael was only 7 years old and Beatrice 5. Since then, she had transformed the colonial house inherited from her grandparents into a small inn, struggling daily to keep the business running and give her children a decent life. The Blue Horizon Inn wasn't luxurious, but it had the charm of Bayshore's colonial buildings, with thick stone walls, colorful windows, and a small inner courtyard with an old fruit tree. In recent years, with increased tourism in the region, Julia had managed to establish a loyal clientele, mainly foreigners and New Yorkers seeking to escape the chaos of the city on weekends. But the last few months had been difficult. The low, Season had extended longer than normal, and the costs of maintaining the inn were constantly rising. To make matters worse, the employee who helped her was becoming increasingly unreliable, and Julia couldn't afford to hire anyone else. Ms. Julia, there's a man at the reception wanting a room, informed Mr. Joe, the elderly gentleman, who took care of the garden and did small repairs at the inn 3 times a week. She hurried to the reception, adjusting her floral apron and trying to look less tired than she actually was. In the small entrance area, a middle-aged man awaited her. He wore simple clothes, jeans, a white t-shirt, and a light jacket, and carried only a worn backpack. His graying hair at the temples and stubble gave him an older appearance than he probably was. "Good afternoon, how can I help you?" asked Julia with a professional smile. The man turned, and she noticed that despite his tired appearance, there was something in his eyes, a gleam of intelligence and an intensity that didn't match his apparently ordinary figure. "Good afternoon. I'm looking for a room, for a somewhat longer stay if possible," he responded with a deep, educated voice. "How long do you plan to stay?" "A few weeks, perhaps a month or more. My name is Andrew. Andrew Sanders," he said with a slight hesitation before pronouncing the surname. Julia noticed the moment of hesitation, but didn't give it much importance. In Bayshore, it was common for people from big cities to seek temporary refuge from their hectic lives. "Well, Mr. Sanders, we normally work more with short stays, but we're in the low season now. I can offer a discount for an extended stay." She quickly consulted her booking ledger. "We have a room available overlooking the inner garden. It's simple, but comfortable." "Sounds perfect," he replied, seeming relieved. While Julia filled out the guest registration form, Andrew looked around, absorbing every detail of the environment. The inn was modest but welcoming, exactly the kind of place where no one would think to look for Richard Anderson. "Are you in Bayshore for work or leisure?" asked Julia, out of hospitality habit. Andrew hesitated again. "I'm working on a personal project. I'm a writer," he improvised, remembering that he needed a convincing story. "Looking for a quiet place to finish my book." "Oh, how interesting. Have you published anything I might know?" "No. This will be my first work," he replied, averting his gaze. "I needed a fresh start, you know." Julia nodded, handing him the room key. "I know exactly what you mean, Mr. Sanders. We all need a fresh start sometimes." As Andrew climbed the stairs toward his room, he had no idea how true those words were for Julia. And she, in turn, couldn't imagine that the ordinary-looking man she had just welcomed to her inn had once been one of the most powerful businessmen in America, and was now a man on the run, carrying secrets that could put them both in danger. The first rays of sunlight came through the cracks of the wooden window when Andrew woke up, momentarily confused about where he was. The simple room, with white walls and a twin bed, was in stark contrast to the presidential suite he used to occupy in luxury hotels around the world. It took a few seconds before reality hit him again. He was no longer Richard Anderson, the finance magnate. He was Andrew Sanders, an unknown writer seeking inspiration in Bayshore. He got up and walked to the small window, opening it to let in the morning breeze that carried the smell of the sea, mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee. Down below in the inn's inner courtyard, Julia was arranging the tables for breakfast, moving with the efficiency of someone who was used to doing everything alone. Andrew descended the wooden stairs that creaked gently under his feet. The breakfast room was empty, except for an elderly couple chatting quietly in a corner. "Good morning, Mr. Sanders," greeted Julia with a warm smile. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than in the last few days," he answered honestly. "And please, call me Andrew." "Great, Andrew. Breakfast is served. We have homemade bread, local fruits, cornbread, and freshly brewed coffee." He served himself and sat at a table near the window, observing the movement of people on the cobblestone streets of the historic center. It was strange not to have the phone ringing constantly, not needing to check emails every 5 minutes, not having assistants and executives awaiting his orders. The silence was both liberating and frightening. "First time in Bayshore?" asked Julia, approaching to serve more coffee. "Yes," he lied. In truth, he had been there a few times, always staying at exclusive resorts in the more isolated part of the coast. If you need tips on places to visit or work on your book, I can help. I know every corner of this town. Thank you, Andrew was interrupted by the noisy arrival of a teenager who came running into the room. Mom! Michael forgot his geography assignment, and the teacher will give him a 0 if he doesn't turn. It in today? Exclaimed the girl, breathless. Calm down, Beatrice, said Julia, placing the coffee pot on the table. Good morning to you too, and where are your manners? We have guests. The girl, who must have been about 13, looked around and smiled embarrassedly. Sorry, good morning. Good morning, replied Andrew, trying not to smile at the situation. The assignment is on top of his desk, explained Julia. You can take it to your brother, but tell him that next time I'll let him face the consequences. Beatrice nodded and ran out as quickly as she had entered. My daughter, explained Julia with a sigh. Teenagers. Sometimes I think I have 3 jobs. Innkeeper, mother, and private detective to find lost things. Andrew laughed, surprising himself with his own reaction. It had been weeks since he had genuinely smiled. How many children do you have? He asked. 2, Beatrice, 13, and Michael, 15. They're the reason for all this, she gestured, encompassing the place. The inn was my grandparents' house. When I found myself alone with 2 small children, turning it into a business seemed the only way out. And their father? As soon as he asked the question, Andrew realized he was being indiscreet, something unusual for someone who had always been calculating and reserved in his social interactions. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry. It's okay, replied Julia, sitting across from him. Jack was a tour guide, one of those who take tourists to trails and waterfalls. We met when I was 20, married quickly, had 2 children in succession. One day he simply said he wasn't born to be a father or husband, packed his bags and never came back. That was 8 years ago. The sincerity and quiet strength with which she told her story impressed Andrew. In the world he had lived in, people wore social masks, hid weaknesses, lied about their lives to seem more successful or happier than they really were. It must have been difficult, he commented. It was, and still is sometimes, she shrugged. But life goes on, right? And you, do you have family? No, he replied, instinctively returning to caution. I've always been very focused on writing, never found time to start a family. Well, it's never too late. And Bayshore is a good place to inspire new beginnings, she said, rising to attend to other guests who were arriving for breakfast. In the days that followed, Andrew established a routine. He spent mornings walking around town, familiarizing himself with the streets, squares, restaurants, and shops. He observed tourists and locals, trying to absorb the slower rhythm of that place. In the afternoon, he would sit in a cafe or on the inn's porch with a notebook and pen, pretending to write his book, while in reality, trying to plan his next step. The truth was, he didn't have a concrete plan. He had left Chicago with the intention of hiding temporarily, until things calmed down and he could contact his brother Robert, a renowned lawyer who might be able to help him legally resolve the situation. But with each passing day, the idea of returning to his old life seemed more distant and less appealing. A week after his arrival, while sitting in the small garden of the inn, Julia approached with a worried expression. Andrew. Sorry to bother. But I need to talk to you. He felt a chill in his stomach. Had she discovered who he was? Had the news about his disappearance reached here? Of course. Is there a problem? He asked, trying to stay calm. Actually, yes. She sat beside him. Since you mentioned you'd be staying for a few weeks, I wanted to be transparent. The employee who helped me here at the inn just quit. She got a better job in Newport. I understand, he said, relieved it wasn't about his identity. And does this affect my stay in any way? No. But it will be harder for me to maintain the same level of service until I find someone to replace her. I may need to ask for your understanding if something isn't perfect in the next few days. Andrew looked at her, noticing the dark circles under her beautiful face and the tension in her shoulders. An absurd idea came to his mind. Maybe I can help, he said, even before fully processing what he was offering. Julia looked at him with surprise. What do you mean? Well, I'm here without much to do besides writing, and to be honest, sometimes I need a break to organize my ideas. I can help with simple tasks if that would be useful. She frowned, clearly confused by the offer. "You're a guest, Andrew. I can't ask you to work here." "I'm not doing this out of obligation. Actually, it would be good for me, too. The more time I spend alone with my thoughts, the harder it becomes to write," he explained, surprising himself with the sincerity in his words. "Even so, I couldn't. How about an agreement? I help a few hours a day and you reduce my daily rate a bit. It would be fair for both of us." Julia studied him for a moment as if trying to decipher his true intentions. Finally, she nodded slowly. "If that's really what you want, we can try. But the moment it starts to interfere with your work, you let me know." "Agreed," he replied, extending his hand to seal the deal. When his fingers touched hers, Andrew felt something strange, a kind of connection he hadn't experienced in a long time. As a man who had spent his life calculating risks and benefits, analyzing people like pieces on a chessboard, that moment of genuine human contact caught him off guard. The next day, Andrew began helping at the inn. His first tasks were simple: carrying guests' luggage, fixing a broken shelf, reorganizing the small storage room. To his surprise, he discovered there was something satisfying about doing manual work, seeing the immediate result of his efforts. One afternoon, while helping serve coffee to a group of tourists, he overheard fragments of a conversation. "Did you see the news about that financial scandal in Chicago? The guy simply disappeared with millions. I heard he fled abroad, Argentina maybe. Wherever he is, he must be laughing at all of us now, living like a king at others' expense." Andrew felt his stomach turn. He left the tray in the kitchen and went out to the yard, needing air. The reality of his situation hit him with full force. While he was building this peaceful new routine in Bayshore, his name was being dragged through the mud, his reputation destroyed, and worse, Edward certainly hadn't given up on finding him. "Is everything okay?" Julia's voice brought him back to the present. She was standing at the kitchen door, observing him with concern. "Yes," he lied. "I just needed some air." "Are you sure? You look pale." "It's just the heat." He forced a smile. "I guess I'm still not used to the climate here." Julia didn't seem convinced, but respected his space. "If you need to talk, I'm here. Sometimes sharing what troubles us helps carry the weight." As she went back inside, Andrew realized it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain his facade. Daily life with Julia and her children was doing something to him, breaking down the barriers he had always kept up. And that scared him more than the possibility of being discovered. 2 weeks had passed since Andrew began helping at the inn. What started as a simple exchange of favors soon transformed into something more. To Julia's surprise, he demonstrated an impressive ability to solve problems and optimize processes, even in the simplest tasks. "Are you sure you're a writer?" she asked jokingly, as she watched Andrew reorganize the inn's small reservation system, transforming the handwritten notebook into a digital spreadsheet on the computer. "Why the doubt?" he replied, without taking his eyes off the screen. "Because you understand administration like few others. Yesterday I saw you explaining to Michael how to calculate the profit margin on the ACAE juice he wants to sell at the science fair." Andrew smiled, trying to disguise the pride he felt hearing that. "Let's say I've had some experience with business before dedicating myself to literature." "Well, whatever your past is, I'm happy you're sharing that knowledge with my children." Michael hasn't stopped talking about how you explained the concept of supply and demand, using the example of the crafts in the square. It was true. In recent days, Andrew had grown closer not only to Julia but also to her children. Michael, the shy and studious teenager, found in him a male figure he never had, bombarding him with questions about economics, technology, and the corporate world. Beatrice, more extroverted and artistic, initially showed resistance, but began to open up after Andrew sincerely praised her drawings and suggested she could transform them into souvenirs for tourists. "They're great, Julia. You've done an amazing job raising them alone." She blushed slightly at the compliment. "I did what any mother would do, but thank you." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled only by the sound of computer keys and the singing of birds in the garden. Andrew allowed himself for a moment to imagine what it would be like if this were his real life. The cozy inn, the peaceful routine, the company of Julia and her children. It was a dangerous thought, he knew, but increasingly frequent. Andrew. Julia broke the silence hesitantly. Tomorrow is Michael's birthday. We're having a small barbecue in the yard, just us, my father, and a few close friends. Would you like to come? I know it's not exactly the ideal environment for a writer seeking tranquility, but I'd love to, he interrupted, surprised by the quickness and sincerity of his response. The smile that lit up Julia's face made his heart race in a way it hadn't for years. The next morning, Andrew woke up early and went down to help with preparations. He found Julia in the kitchen, already busy preparing homemade mayonnaise. "Good morning, you didn't need to wake up so early," she said, with her hair tied in a colorful scarf. "I want to help." "What can I do?" "You can start by chopping those onions and tomatoes for the vinaigrette." She pointed to the ingredients set out on the counter. As they worked side by side in the small kitchen, Andrew noticed how their movements naturally synchronized, as if they had done this together hundreds of times. "You never told me why you chose to be a writer," commented Julia, while seasoning the meat for the barbecue. The question caught him off guard. His false story about being a writer in search of inspiration had worked until now. But the more time he spent with Julia, the more uncomfortable he felt with the lie. "I always liked creating stories," he improvised. "But before that, I tried to follow a more conventional path. I worked in the financial market for many years. And what made you give it all up to write?" Andrew stopped what he was doing and looked at her. There was something in Julia's eyes that invited him to open up, to trust. "I realized I was living a life that wasn't really mine," he answered, surprising himself with the truth in his words. "I was surrounded by people, but completely alone. I had money, status, but no real connection with anything or anyone." Julia nodded, understanding. "Sometimes life takes us down paths that seem to make sense at the moment, but that take us away from who we really are." "Exactly," he agreed, feeling a strange relief at finally sharing something true about himself, even if in a veiled way. Michael's birthday party was simple, but full of joy. In the inn's yard, decorated with colorful pennants and lights, about 10 people gathered, some neighbors, 2 school friends of the birthday boy, and Julia's father, Mr. Gerald, an elderly gentleman with white hair and an easy smile. Andrew observed everything with a sense of enchantment. It was so different from the sophisticated and empty parties he used to attend in his previous life. Here the laughter was genuine, the conversation sincere, and the affection palpable. "So, Andrew, what do you think of my daughter?" asked Mr. Gerald, sitting next to him with a beer in hand. "What do you mean?" he replied, confused. "Of Julia, as an innkeeper. She told me you're helping her organize things over there." "Ah, yes," Andrew smiled, relieved. "She's impressive. Does the work of 3 people alone and still manages to be an exemplary mother." Mr. Gerald nodded, proud. "My girl has always been a warrior, since she was little, facing life head-on. When that good-for-nothing Jack left her, many people thought she wouldn't make it. But look at her," he pointed to Julia, who was laughing while helping Michael light the candles on the cake. "Stronger than ever." "You're an admirable family," commented Andrew sincerely. "And you, young man, don't you have family?" "I have a brother," replied Andrew, allowing himself another truth. "But we've grown apart over the years." "Disagreement?" "Differences. In values, I'd say. He was always more ethical in his choices." Mr. Gerald studied him for a moment as if seeing beyond the words. "You know, son, it's never too late to recognize mistakes and seek reconciliation. Life is too short to hold grudges, especially against those we love." Before Andrew could respond, they were interrupted by Michael, who approached excitedly. "Andrew, come see the present my mom gave me." The teenager proudly displayed a used but well-maintained laptop. "Wow, that's great," Michael replied. Andrew, genuinely happy for the boy. "Andrew fixed it," explained Julia, approaching. "It belonged to a guest who left it here last year and never came back to get it. It had system problems, but he managed to recover it. "And now I can make that financial control spreadsheet you taught me," exclaimed Michael, enthusiastic. Andrew felt a strange warmth in his chest, a mixture of pride and belonging that he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if, for the first time in years, he was doing something that really mattered. The party continued until nightfall, when guests began to say goodbye. Andrew helped collect the cups and plates, while the children, exhausted but happy, went to bed. When he finished organizing the kitchen, he found Julia sitting alone on the garden bench, contemplating the starry sky. "May I join you?" he asked. "Of course," she smiled, making room on the bench. For a few minutes they sat in silence, appreciating the quiet night and the breeze that brought the smell of the sea. "Thank you for everything you've been doing for us," Julia finally said. "Not just for the help at the inn, but for being so kind to my children. No need to thank me. You welcomed me when I needed it most, even without knowing." She turned to face him, and Andrew felt his heart race. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of curiosity, understanding, and something more, something he didn't dare name. "You know, Andrew, sometimes I get the feeling you're running from something," she said softly. "I'm not asking you to tell me your secrets. I just want you to know that whatever it is, we all deserve a second chance." The words hit Andrew like a punch to the stomach. For a brief moment he considered telling the whole truth, who he really was, what he had done, why he was hiding. But the fear of losing what he had found here, the fear of seeing Julia's look change from trust to contempt, stopped him. "Sometimes it's hard to believe we deserve that chance," he replied, looking away. Julia covered his hand with hers, simple gesture that sent an electric current through his entire body. "Believe it, Andrew. I believe it." In that moment, under the stars of Bayshore, something changed between them. A connection that went beyond words, beyond the stories they told each other, true or not. In the days that followed, Andrew immersed himself even more in the routine of the inn and the life of the family. Using his business skills, he began implementing small improvements that made a big difference. He created a simple website for the Blue Horizon Inn, reorganized the reservation system to maximize occupancy, and even suggested partnerships with local restaurants and tour operators. One afternoon, while reviewing the inn's accounts together, Andrew noticed that Julia seemed worried. "What is it?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "The high season is coming, and normally it's when I manage to build a financial reserve for the weaker months. But this year, with all the problems we've had, I'm worried if we'll manage." Andrew carefully studied the numbers. The inn wasn't doing badly, but it operated with a very tight margin. Any unforeseen event could cause serious problems. "Julia, I've observed how you manage this place, and I believe there's untapped potential here," he said, choosing his words carefully. "What do you think about expanding the business a bit?" "How?" "I don't have money for renovations or expansions." "I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about using what you already have more strategically." He opened the laptop and showed her some research he had done. Bayshore is becoming an increasingly sought-after destination for corporate retreats and small business events. With minimal adaptations, we could transform the breakfast room into a multifunctional space for workshops and meetings. Julia looked at him with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "You really aren't just a writer, are you?" Andrew felt his face heat up. "Let's say I've had some experience with business strategies, and you're willing to use that experience to help a small inn like mine? It's not just an inn, Julia. It's your dream, your children's future, and for now, it's my home too." Her eyes shone with emotion, and for a moment, Andrew thought she might cry. Instead, Julia did something that caught him completely off guard. She leaned in and kissed him softly on the lips. It was a brief kiss, almost shy, but it sent waves of warmth throughout Andrew's body. When they separated, both seemed equally surprised by what had just happened. Sorry," mumbled Julia, blushing intensely. "I don't know what came over me." Andrew gently touched her face, feeling the softness of her skin under his fingers. "Don't apologize. I've been wanting to do that since I really got to know you." They looked at each other in silence, the tension between them palpable. But before they could say or do anything else, they were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. "Mum, look what I found on the internet," exclaimed Beatrice, entering the room with her phone in hand, completely oblivious to the moment she had just interrupted. As Julia turned to her daughter, Andrew felt a confusing mixture of emotions: happiness, for the moment they had shared, fear of what it meant, and mainly guilt for becoming increasingly involved with that family while keeping secrets that could put everyone in danger. That night, lying in bed in his small room, Andrew made a decision. He needed to tell Julia the truth. He couldn't continue building a relationship based on lies. But first, he needed to ensure that his confession wouldn't bring dangerous consequences for her and her children. For that, there was only one person who could help him: his brother, Robert. The decision to contact Robert wasn't easy. Andrew had avoided any communication that could reveal his whereabouts, but now he felt he had no choice. The following morning, he went to an internet cafe in downtown Bayshore, away from curious eyes at the inn. Using a newly created anonymous email, he sent a short message to his brother. "I need your help. I'm safe, but things have gotten complicated. Can we meet? Wednesday 3 p.m. Rainbow Falls. Come alone. A." While waiting for a response, Andrew intensified his efforts to help Julia with the new inn project. Together, they transformed the breakfast room into a versatile space that could function as a meeting room or venue for small events. Using his anonymous contacts, he began promoting the space in business groups, highlighting the tranquility and colonial charm as differentiators for corporate retreats. "How do you make it seem so simple?" asked Julia admiringly, as she watched Andrew explain to a potential client over the phone the advantages of the inn for a 2-day workshop. "It's just a matter of finding the right angle," he replied, after hanging up. "Every business has something unique to offer. The secret is identifying that differential and communicating it effectively." "You talk like a true businessman," she commented with a curious smile. "Are you sure you weren't hiding an MBA in your backpack when you arrived here?" Andrew laughed, but felt the familiar knot in his stomach that accompanied each lie. "Let's say I learned a few things along the way." 3 days passed without a response from Robert, and Andrew began to get anxious. What if his brother had ignored his message? Or worse, what if he had alerted the authorities? On Tuesday, the eve of the scheduled meeting, Andrew was helping Michael with a math assignment when his cell phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "I'll be there, alone as you asked. R." The feeling of relief was immediate, but soon replaced by a new wave of anxiety. What would he say to his brother? How would he explain not only his disappearance, but also his new feelings for Julia and her family? "Andrew, are you okay?" Michael's voice brought him back to reality. "You look worried." "I'm fine. Just remembered something I need to resolve. Tomorrow," he replied, forcing a smile. "Let's get back to the equations." That night, while everyone was already asleep, Andrew sat on the inn's porch with his notebook, the one that supposedly contained his novel in progress, but which actually served as a diary where he recorded his most intimate thoughts. He wrote at length about Julia, about how she had transformed his worldview, about how he felt guilty for hiding the truth, about his fear of losing what they had built when she discovered who he really was. So absorbed was he in his thoughts that he didn't notice a silent presence behind him. "I didn't know you wrote in the middle of the night," Julia said softly, making him jump from his chair and instinctively close the notebook. "Julia!" "You startled me," he exclaimed, feeling his heart racing. "Sorry," she smiled, sitting in the chair beside him. She wore a simple robe over her nightgown, and her loose hair framed her face in a way Andrew found irresistible. "I couldn't sleep. I think I'm anxious about this new direction we're giving the inn." "Everything will work out," he assured her, covering her hand with his. "You have a natural instinct for business. You just needed a little push." Julia tilted her head, studying him with that perceptive look that always seemed to see beyond his words. "It's strange, you know. I feel like I've known you for years, not weeks, as if you were always meant to be here. Andrew felt a lump in his throat. I feel the same way. But at the same time, she continued, there are moments when you seem so distant, as if you're carrying something heavy inside you. He looked away, unable to hold her gaze. Andrew, she gently held his face, forcing him to look her in the eyes. I don't know what happened in your past, and I'm not asking you to tell me if you're not ready. I just want you to know that whatever it is, it won't change what I feel for you. The words hit Andrew like a punch to the chest. What would she feel if she knew he was a wanted man? That he had been accused of manipulating the financial market, that he had enriched himself at the expense of investors who trusted him, that his real name was plastered across unflattering headlines throughout the country. Julia, he began, feeling the weight of the truth on the tip of his tongue. She placed a finger on his lips, silencing him. It doesn't have to be now. I just want you to know that I'm here when you're ready. And then under the starry sky of Bayshore she kissed him again. But this time it wasn't a shy or hesitant kiss. It was a kiss that spoke of desire, of trust, of a future that both were beginning to envision together. When they separated, Andrew knew he could no longer delay. He needed to resolve his past before it destroyed any chance of a future with Julia. Tomorrow I need to go out for a few hours, he said. I have an important meeting. Something related to your book? She asked. Not exactly, it's something personal, but I promise that when I return, we'll talk. There are things about me that you need to know. Julia nodded, understanding. I'll be waiting. The next morning, Andrew left early, claiming he needed to meet an old colleague who was passing through the region. He rented a motorcycle in town and headed toward Rainbow Falls, a tourist spot about half an hour from Bayshore, known for its smooth rocks that formed a natural water slide in the crystal-clear water. The place was relatively empty that Wednesday outside the tourist season. Andrew sat on a rock, observing the movement of the water and trying to organize his thoughts. How would he explain to Robert everything that had happened? How would he ask for his help without compromising Julia and her family? At exactly 3 p.m., Robert appeared, always punctual, always impeccable even in an informal setting like that. He wore jeans and a polo shirt, but still emanated the aura of authority and competence that had always characterized him as one of the most respected lawyers in Chicago. Richard, he said, using Andrew's real name, as he approached cautiously. Robert? Andrew stood up, feeling an unexpected emotion at seeing his brother after so long. For a moment they just looked at each other, assessing the changes that time and circumstances had imposed. Robert looked older, more tired, with grey strands at his temples that weren't there the last time they met. How you look different, Robert finally commented. I almost didn't recognize you with that beard and tan. A lot has changed, Andrew replied simply. Robert looked around, as if verifying they were really alone. Do you have any idea of the chaos you caused? Your face is in all the newspapers. The FBI is looking for you. Investors are furious. I know. Andrew raised his hands in an appeasing gesture. But you need to believe me, it's not as they're painting it. Edward set this all up. Edward? Robert frowned. Your ex-partner? Yes. He forged documents, manipulated evidence. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. And then the threats started. What threats? Andrew explained about the anonymous messages, about how he feared not only for his freedom, but for his life. Robert listened attentively, his face revealing a mixture of concern and skepticism. Why didn't you come to me immediately? Asked the lawyer. Because you always made clear what you thought of my business methods, Andrew replied bitterly. I thought you wouldn't believe me. Robert sighed deeply. You're my brother, Richard. Regardless of our differences, I would always be by your side. The words touched Andrew more than he expected. I'm here now, aren't I? I need your help, Robert. What exactly do you want me to do? The situation is serious. The accusations are serious. I need you to investigate Edward. I'm sure he left traces, and I need time to resolve another situation. Robert raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What other situation? Andrew hesitated, uncertain about how much he should reveal. But if there was anyone he could trust, it was his brother. "I met someone," he finally said. "Someone special. She and her family took me in without knowing who I really am. And now I'm in love with her." Robert's expression changed from surprise to genuine concern. "Richard, you can't be serious. You're running from the authorities, being hunted by a dangerous man, and you decided to get romantically involved with an innocent?" "It wasn't a decision, Robert. It happened, and now I don't know what to do. I can't simply disappear from her life, but I also can't continue lying." "And what do you expect? That I'll clear your name overnight and you can return to this woman as an unjustly accused hero?" Andrew's frustration grew. "No, I expect that you, as my brother and as a competent lawyer, will help me find a way. If Edward really set this all up, there must be evidence. You have contacts, you know the system better than anyone." Robert ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he always made when thinking intensely. "I'll need details. Everything you can tell me about the operations, the documents Edward might have forged, the exact moments when you realized something was wrong." For almost 2 hours, sitting by the waterfall, the brothers discussed every aspect of the case. Andrew provided all the information he could remember, and Robert took notes meticulously on his tablet. "This will take time," Robert finally said, "and I can't promise anything, but I'll do what I can." "Thank you," replied Andrew, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Really, thank you." "Meanwhile," continued the lawyer, "you need to make a decision about this woman. What's her name?" "Julia." "Julia," repeated Robert. "You need to be honest with her, Richard. If you really care about her, as you say, she deserves to know the truth." Andrew nodded, knowing his brother was right. "I'll tell her everything tonight." "And be prepared for the consequences," warned Robert. "Not everyone is willing to build a life with someone carrying the kind of baggage you have." The words hurt, but Andrew knew they were true. There was a real possibility that Julia would completely reject him. When she discovered who he really was— "How will we communicate?" asked Andrew, as they prepared to say goodbye. "I created an anonymous email to respond to your message. Use it only in emergencies, and always from public computers. And Richard—" Robert hesitated. "Be careful. Edward isn't the type of man who gives up easily." The brothers embraced briefly, a rare gesture between two men who had always maintained a more formal than affectionate relationship. Then they went separate ways, Robert back to Chicago and his investigative mission, and Andrew back to Bayshore, to Julia, and to the truth he could no longer delay. On the way back, Andrew mentally rehearsed how he would tell Julia everything. How would he explain that he wasn't Andrew Sanders, the writer seeking inspiration, but Richard Anderson, the businessman on the run? How would he make her understand that despite the lies, his feelings were genuine? He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he almost didn't notice the dark car following him at a distance. Only when he reached the limits of Bayshore did a feeling of uneasiness make him look back. The car had disappeared, but the sensation of being watched remained. Upon arriving at the inn, he found Julia excited. She ran to him as soon as she saw him enter. "Andrew, you won't believe it. We received a reservation for a corporate retreat. A technology company from Boston wants to use our space for a 3-day workshop next month. It's the first big reservation since we implemented your ideas." Her enthusiasm was contagious, and for a moment Andrew forgot his worries. He spun her in the air in a spontaneous hug, sharing her joy. "That's amazing, Julia. I told you it would." "Work!" When he put her back on the ground, their eyes met and Andrew felt his heart tighten. How could he risk losing that? How could he destroy the happiness he saw in her eyes? "You said you had something to tell me," Julia reminded him, as if reading his thoughts. It seemed important. Andrew took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Yes, I do. Can we talk in private after dinner? It's complicated." She nodded, a shadow of concern passing over her face. "Of course. The kids are going to sleep at my father's house tonight. We'll have all the time we need." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of everyday activities, while Andrew felt the tension growing inside him. He helped Michael and Beatrice pack their bags for the night at their grandfather's house, talked with some guests, and even managed to fix a problem with the plumbing in the ground floor bathroom. In each moment, he felt Julia's gaze upon him, curious and a little apprehensive. When, finally, her children left and the inn became quiet, Julia prepared tea and called him to the porch. The night was clear, with a full moon illuminating the sky and reflecting on the tranquil waters of the bay. "So," she said, sitting across from him, "what's so important that you need to tell me?" Andrew looked at this woman who had changed his life in such a short time. How to begin? How to find the right words? "Julia," he finally said, his voice deeper than normal, "my name isn't Andrew Sanders, and I'm not a writer." She stared at him in silence, her face unreadable. "My real name is Richard Anderson. I am a businessman in the financial market in Chicago, or at least I was until a scandal exploded and I had to flee." The silence that followed Richard's confession seemed endless. Julia remained motionless, her eyes fixed on him, her expression oscillating between shock and disbelief. "Richard Anderson," she finally repeated, as if testing the name in her mouth. "The executive who disappeared after that fraud scandal, the one from the news." He nodded, feeling the weight of each word. "Yes. But it's not as the newspapers are showing, Julia. I was framed by my ex-partner, Edward. He forged documents, manipulated evidence. And instead of facing the accusations, you ran," she completed with a strangely calm voice. "I had no choice. Edward has dangerous connections. He started sending threats, not just against me, but against people close to me. I feared for my safety." Julia rose abruptly, walking to the edge of the porch. With her back to him, she asked, "Why Bayshore? Why my inn?" "It was coincidence," he answered honestly. "I needed a quiet place off the radar. Your inn seemed safe." She turned to face him, her eyes now shining with contained tears. "And everything else? Was that coincidence too? Your feelings for me, for my children, your help with the inn? All part of your disguise?" "No." He stood up, approaching her. "This is real, Julia. More real than anything I've ever felt. You, Michael, Beatrice, you showed me a life I didn't even know I wanted to have. A life of meaning, of true connections." She raised her hand, preventing him from coming closer. "I don't know if I can believe you now. How can I trust someone who has lived on lies for weeks?" The words hit Richard like a physical blow. "I understand your distrust, but I'm being sincere now. I met my brother today, Robert. He's a lawyer and is going to help me prove my innocence." "And if you can't prove it? If you're actually guilty, have you thought about that?" The question hung between them like a heavy cloud. Richard had never really considered that possibility, that perhaps at some level he was responsible for what happened. "I made mistakes, Julia," he finally admitted. "I was ambitious, sometimes cruel in business. I didn't always play fair, but I didn't commit the crimes I'm accused of. And being here, with you, has made me want to be a better person, someone worthy of what I found here." Julia took a deep breath, trying to process everything she was hearing. Her eyes wandered over the inn's garden, over the lights of the old town that twinkled in the distance, as if looking for answers in the familiar things that surrounded her. "I need time," she said at last. "I need to think. This is too big to absorb at once." Richard nodded, respecting her space. "I understand. I can leave the inn tomorrow if you prefer." "No," she replied quickly, surprising him. "I don't want you to go. At least, not until we've talked more. And besides, Michael and Beatrice would be devastated if you simply disappeared." The mention of the children tightened Richard's heart. He had genuinely become attached to them, seeing in Michael a bit of himself when young, curious, intelligent, with potential for great things, and in Beatrice a creative force and honesty that enchanted him. "Thank you," he said, feeling undeserving of her consideration. Julia walked to the door, clearly needing space. "Good night, and, Richard, we'll talk more tomorrow." And with that, she went inside, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of his confession. That night, Richard could barely sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, imagining the possible outcomes of that situation. Had he lost Julia? Forever? Would it be possible to rebuild trust after such a big lie? and even if she forgave him, what future could they have together while he remained a wanted man? When the first rays of sunlight began to enter through the window, he was already up, determined to do whatever was necessary to fix things. He went down to the kitchen before everyone else and prepared breakfast, something he had never done in his previous life as Richard Anderson, but had learned by observing Julia in the last few weeks. She appeared shortly after, visibly surprised, to find him preparing tapioca and cutting fruits. "Good morning," he said, hesitant. "Good morning," she replied, with a formality that hadn't existed between them for weeks. "I made coffee," he offered, like a white flag. "And I tried to make tapioca the way you like it, with cheese and banana." Julia accepted the cup he offered, their fingers briefly touching in the process. "Thank you." They sat at the kitchen table, silence weighing between them. Finally, it was Julia who spoke. "I spent the night thinking. I looked up your name on the internet," she paused. "There are many serious accusations against you." "I know," he replied, staring at the coffee cup. "But I also found old articles from before the scandal. You built an empire practically from scratch. You were respected in the market, considered a financial genius." Richard raised his eyes, surprised by the direction the conversation was taking. "I managed to read between the lines, Richard. You were ruthless in business, but you also had social projects, invested in sustainable startups, created scholarship programs for young talents." "I was trying to compensate," he admitted. "Part of me always knew there was something wrong with the path I was following. Those projects were an attempt to balance the scales." Julia studied him for a long moment, as if trying to see beyond the surface, beyond the headlines and accusations. "I may not know who Richard Anderson, the businessman, is, but I know Andrew Sanders, the man who entered my inn almost a month ago. The man who fixed the roof under the scorching sun, who taught math to my son, who gave marketing advice to my daughter, who kissed me under the stars." Richard felt a wave of hope growing in his chest. "I'm not saying everything is okay," she continued. "You lied to me, to my children. That's not something I can simply ignore. But I also can't ignore everything we've lived, everything we've built together." "What are you saying?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. "I'm saying that I want to know Richard Anderson, the real you without more lies, and then we'll decide what to do." It was more than he expected, more than he deserved. "Thank you, Julia. I promise I won't disappoint you. Not again." "There's one more thing," she said, her expression becoming serious. "If you're being sought, if this Edward is as dangerous as you say, that means you brought a risk to my home, to my children." Richard felt his blood freeze. She was right, of course. In his selfishness, in his need for protection and connection, he had potentially put them all in danger. "I'll leave today," he said resolutely. "I can't risk your safety." "That's not what I'm asking," Julia replied. "I'm saying we need a plan. If you really want to clear your name, if you really believe you can prove your innocence, then let's do this together, but with complete honesty. From now on." The proposal caught him completely off guard. "You want to help me?" "I want to help the man I fell in love with," she answered simply. "Whether he's Andrew or Richard." At that moment they heard the noise of the front gate. Michael and Beatrice were back from their grandfather's house. Julia and Richard exchanged a significant look. "Should we tell them?" he asked. "Not everything. Not now," she replied. "They're too young to carry this kind of weight. For now you're still Andrew to them, but we need to prepare them for the possibility of changes." Richard nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words. Together they went to receive the children, trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy, while internally both processed the storm that had just passed between them, and the one that might still be coming. That Sunday unfolded in an almost surreal way for Richard. On the outside he was still Andrew, helping Michael with a science project, listening to Beatrice tell about the new drawing she was creating, doing the usual tasks at the inn. But inside he felt different, lighter for having shared his secret with Julia, but also more aware of the fragility of everything they had built. At night, after the children went to bed, Richard and Julia returned to the porch to continue their conversation. He told everything, about his rise in the financial market, about how he met Edward, about the questionable operations they carried out together, about how Edward began to go too far, forging documents and manipulating the market in ways that even Richard considered unacceptable. "When I discovered what he was doing, I confronted him," explained Richard. "I threatened to expose him, to end our agreements. That's when he turned against me. He began creating a false trail, implicating me in frauds I didn't even know about, and then came the threats." "What kind of threats?" asked Julia, now genuinely concerned. "At first, subtle. Comments about how it would be a shame if something happened to my apartment, to my car. Then, more direct. Photos of me in places where I didn't know I was being observed. A message saying accidents happen every day. And you didn't go to the police. With what evidence? Edward is careful. And I didn't have completely clean hands either. I feared that if I went to the authorities, I would end up incriminating myself in other matters." Julia processed all of this in silence, her eyes reflecting the starlight. Finally, she asked, "And what did your brother say? Does he believe you?" "Robert has always been the righteous one in the family. He always disapproved of my methods, my associations, but he believes me about Edward, or at least he's willing to investigate." "And how long will that take?" "I don't know. Weeks, maybe months. Edward is powerful, has connections." Julia took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for what she was about to say. "Meanwhile, we have a business to run. That reservation from the corporate group could be the beginning of something bigger for the inn. We can't lose focus." Richard looked at her with admiration. Even in the face of a revelation that would turn anyone's life upside down, she maintained her determination, the strength that had attracted him from the beginning. "You're amazing, you know that?" he said, gently touching her face. "I'm practical," she corrected him, but a smile played on her lips. "And besides, it's not like I can afford to fall apart now. I have 2 children who depend on me, an inn to manage, and apparently a fugitive to hide." He laughed, feeling a wave of affection and gratitude that almost choked him. "I promise I'll make up for all this, Julia. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this situation, to give you and the children the life you deserve." "I don't need grandiose promises, Richard," she replied, using his real name for the first time without hesitation. "I just need you to be honest with me from now on. The rest we'll face together." They sealed this new pact with a kiss, different from all the previous ones. It was no longer a kiss between Andrew and Julia, but between Richard and Julia, with all the truths, fears, and hopes they now shared. The days that followed brought a new dynamic to the inn. On the outside, everything seemed the same. Richard continued to be presented as Andrew to the guests and Julia's children, but in private moments they planned, discussed strategies, sought ways to face what was to come. A week after his confession, Richard received a coded email from Robert. His brother had begun investigating Edward and discovered some promising leads. Documents with inconsistent dates, witnesses who were beginning to question their stories, suspicious financial transfers. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "This is good, isn't it?" asked Julia when he shared the news. "It's a beginning," replied Richard cautiously, "but Robert warns that Edward is alert. It seems he hired private investigators to look for me." "Do you think he can find you here?" "I hope not. I was careful. I used only cash fake documents, avoided cameras as much as I could, but we can't underestimate him." As they talked, they didn't notice Michael standing at the door, listening to part of the conversation. The teenager moved away silently, confused by what he had just heard. Who was Robert? Why did Andrew, if that was even his name, use fake documents? And who was this Edward who was looking for him? That night, Michael rummaged through the backpack that Andrew Richard had left in the storage room. Among the few possessions, he found a notebook, the one everyone thought contained the novel in progress. He took it to his room and, feeling guilty but determined, began to read. What he found were not chapters of a book but diary entries, intimate reflections of a man divided between his past and the present he was building in Bayshore. Confessions about Julia, about her children, about the fear of losing everything again. One entry in particular caught his attention. How do I tell Julia that everything I built before was based on quicksand? That while I accumulated wealth, something inside me was slowly dying? That only now, helping to fix a broken gutter or teaching Michael about compound interest, do I feel truly alive? Michael closed the notebook, feeling simultaneously intrusive and protective. There was something wrong with Andrew, or whatever his real name was, but there was also something genuine in his feelings for the family. The teenager decided to keep what he discovered a secret, at least for now. But he began to observe the mysterious guest with new eyes, alert to any sign that his mother or sister might be in danger. Meanwhile, Richard intensified his efforts to transform the inn. The first corporate group would arrive in 2 weeks, and he wanted everything to be perfect. He used his knowledge to create special packages, improve the inn's online presence, and even establish partnerships with local restaurants and attractions. "You really understand this," commented Julia, as they reviewed the financial spreadsheets together one night. "Maybe you should have been a small business consultant instead of a mega businessman." "Maybe this is my chance to start over," he replied, half joking, half serious. "Richard Anderson, consultant for inns in historic towns." She laughed, but her eyes revealed a genuine consideration of the idea. "You know, that wouldn't be so bad. You clearly have a talent for it, and you seem happier here than you ever looked in the photos I saw of you in the newspapers." He reflected on this. It was true. Even with all the stress, with the uncertainty about his future, he had never felt so at peace, so fulfilled as in the last few weeks. "It's different when you build something with purpose," he said thoughtfully. "Not just to see numbers grow in a bank account, but to create something that has meaning, that makes a difference in people's lives. Like a family inn in Bayshore," she gently teased. "Exactly," he smiled, leaning in to kiss her. But while Richard and Julia built plans and dreams, external forces were moving. In Chicago, Edward Matthews was receiving a report from a private investigator who had followed Robert Anderson to Bayshore the previous week. The report had no concrete evidence, but suspected that the lawyer might have met with his missing brother. Edward smiled to himself, tasting the approach of revenge. If Richard was in Bayshore, it was only a matter of time until he found him. And when that happened, he would make his ex-partner pay for everything. For the threat of exposure, for the escape, and mainly for always being the brilliant Richard Anderson, while he, Edward, was nothing but a shadow, a supporting actor. In another man's success story, he picked up the phone and made a call. "Prepare the team, I think we know where our friend is hiding." The historic town of Bayshore was dawning under a light drizzle, typical of autumn in the region. The cobblestone streets glistened wet, while the grey sky promised a stronger storm for the end of the day. Richard observed the rain through the window of his room, feeling a restlessness he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the closed weather, perhaps it was the email Robert had sent the night before, informing that Edward was intensifying the search. "Any problem?" asked Julia, entering the room with a coffee tray. "Just worried," he admitted, turning to her. "Robert thinks Edward is getting closer and closer." Julia put the tray on the small table and approached him, wrapping his waist in a comforting hug. In the last 2 weeks, since the revelation of Richard's true identity, they had grown even closer. Honesty, though painful at first, had paved the way for a deeper intimacy. "We have to trust that your brother will get the necessary evidence before that happens," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "And if he doesn't get it in time?" "If Edward finds me here, you and the children could be in danger." "Let's not think about that now," she reassured him, though Richard could feel the tension in her body. "We have the group from the technology company arriving tomorrow. We need to focus on that." He nodded, trying to push away the dark thoughts. The first corporate retreat at the Blue Horizon Inn was too important an opportunity to be compromised by his concerns. In the last few days, they had worked hard to transform the inn, adapting spaces, improving facilities, creating a professional but welcoming environment. "You're right," he agreed, kissing her softly. "Let's focus on what we can control now." They went down together for breakfast, where Michael was already sitting, leafing through a math book. The teenager raised his eyes when they entered, his gaze lingering on Richard with an intensity that didn't go unnoticed. "Good morning, champ," greeted Richard, trying to act normally. "Studying early?" "I have a test on Friday," replied Michael dryly, returning his attention to the book. Julia gave her son a questioning look. "Is everything okay, Michael?" "Everything's great," he replied without raising his eyes, "just concentrating." Richard and Julia exchanged worried glances. In recent days, Michael's behavior had changed. The boy, normally enthusiastic and talkative, especially with Richard, had become more closed off, almost suspicious. "If you need help with math, I'm available," offered Richard, serving himself coffee. Michael merely nodded, still not looking at him. Julia was about to insist when Beatrice came running into the room, excited as always. "Mom, Andrew, you won't believe it. The art teacher loved my souvenir project. She said I have commercial and artistic talent." The girl's excitement was contagious, momentarily breaking the tension in the environment. Richard smiled, genuinely proud. It had been he who suggested that Beatrice transform her drawings into small souvenirs, refrigerator magnets, bookmarks, and postcards with scenes of Bayshore, after noticing the girl's talent for capturing the essence of the historic town in simple but expressive strokes. "That's amazing, Beth," he exclaimed, opening his arms to receive her in a hug she promptly accepted. "I knew you could do it. She said I can even sell at the craft fair at the end of the month. I just need materials to make more." "We can solve that," assured Julia, exchanging a complicit smile with Richard. "I'm very proud of you, daughter." The rest of breakfast proceeded in a lighter mood, with Beatrice dominating the conversation. With her ambitious plans for the small artistic enterprise, Michael remained quiet, but Richard noticed that the boy occasionally observed him when he thought no one was paying attention. After breakfast, everyone dedicated themselves to the final preparations for the arrival of the corporate group. Richard supervised the installation of a small workstation in the main hall with a printer, laptops, and reinforced Wi-Fi, an investment Julia had made, trusting in his vision for the future of the inn. In the middle of the afternoon, while adjusting the internet connection, Richard was surprised by Michael, who entered the room silently and closed the door behind him. "We need to talk," said the teenager, with a seriousness that didn't match his 15 years. "Of course, Michael. Any problem with the science project?" "It's not about the project. It's about you, or should I say about Richard Anderson?" The world seemed to freeze around them. Richard felt the blood drain from his face as he faced the boy who, he now realized, knew much more than he should. "How?" "I read your diary," admitted Michael without hesitation. "I know I shouldn't have, but I heard you and my mom talking about fake documents and someone looking for you. I was worried." Richard ran his hand through his hair, trying to process what was happening. "Michael, Does my mom know?" interrupted the boy. "Yes, she knows. I told her the truth 2 weeks ago." Michael nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. "And she decided to help you, typical of her." "Your mother is an extraordinary woman," agreed Richard, still uncertain about how to handle the situation. "Michael, I know you must be confused and probably angry that I lied, but do you really like her?" cut in the teenager, looking him directly in the eyes. "My mom. Is it real, or just another part of your disguise?" The question, direct and straightforward, caught Richard by surprise. But the answer came easily, without need for reflection. "It's real, Michael. More real than anything I've ever felt. I love your mom, and I care deeply about you and Beatrice too." The boy studied him for a long moment, as if assessing the sincerity of his words. "In your diary, you wrote that you feel more alive fixing things here and teaching me math than when you were a rich businessman. Is that true?" "Every word," confirmed Richard, moved to realize that Michael had really read his most intimate reflections. "I discovered here, with you all, what really matters in life. And this guy, Edward, is he really dangerous?" "I fear so. That's why I'm worried about you. If he finds me here..." "I understand." Michael seemed to reflect deeply. You're not going to run away and leave my mom, are you? Like my dad did. The question hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. Of course, that would be the boy's concern. Having been abandoned once, he feared it would happen again. No, Michael, he replied firmly. I won't abandon you. We're facing this together, your mom and I, and I'll do everything in my power to protect this family. The word family hung between them, loaded with meaning. Michael nodded slowly, finally seeming to reach a decision. Okay then. I'll trust you. But if you hurt my mom or Beth in any way, you have my word, Michael, and thank you for not telling your sister. She's too young to carry this kind of concern. She likes you a lot, commented Michael, now more relaxed. She thinks you're the greatest since you helped with her art project. She's special. You both are. A comfortable silence established itself between them, a new mutual understanding that went beyond words. Finally, Michael smiled slightly. So, are you still going to help me with that compound interest formula for the project? Of course, replied Richard, feeling immense relief. Whenever you want. The boy nodded and left the room, leaving. Richard with a strange feeling of having just passed some kind of test and apparently having been approved. Later, when he told Julia about the conversation with Michael, she didn't seem as surprised as he expected. I suspected he might have discovered something, she admitted. Michael has always been observant, and in the last few weeks he was acting strangely when you were around. You're not angry that he read my diary? I should be, but I understand why he did it. He was protecting the family. It's what he's always tried to do since his father left. Richard nodded, now better understanding the teenager's behavior. He's an incredible boy, Julia. Brave, intelligent, loyal. Like his mother, she joked, but her eyes shone with pride. Exactly, like his mother, he agreed, pulling her close. That night, despite the rain now falling heavily outside, there was a sense of calm in the inn. One storm had been avoided. Michael's suspicion transformed into a cautious alliance. But none of them imagined that a much bigger storm was approaching. The next morning, the corporate group arrived as planned. 12 executives from a technology company in Boston, excited about the idea of a retreat in a historic and tranquil environment. Julia welcomed them with her characteristic hospitality, while Richard, in the role of Andrew, the inn's assistant, took care of logistics and technical needs. The day proceeded without problems, with the group alternating between work sessions in the adapted room and leisure moments exploring the town. Richard was surprised by the ease with which he assumed the role of host, guiding the executives about local attractions, recommended restaurants, and even giving some business tips when the subject naturally arose. "You're quite a host," commented Julia when they finally had a moment alone after dinner. "They're loving your insights. I'm just applying what I learned in recent years, but in a more human way," he replied, smiling. "I think you've finally found your calling," she teased. Little did they imagine that, while they were talking, a dark car was parking a few blocks from the inn. 3 men got out, looking discreetly around before heading to a small hotel nearby. One of them was Edward Matthews. The next morning dawned sunny, as if the previous night's storm had washed away all the tension in the air. The corporate group started their activities early, and the inn buzzed with a productive energy that Julia had never experienced before. "This is amazing," she commented to Richard as they observed the movement from the reception desk. "If we can get a few more groups like this, we can really transform the business." "And we will," he assured her. "Your father told me he has a friend who organizes yoga retreats. We could adapt that space in the yard near the fruit tree." "Always thinking ahead, aren't you?" She smiled, leaning in to kiss him quickly. It was at that moment that the door of the inn opened and Richard felt his heart stop. A tall man, approximately 50 years old, with well-groomed grey hair and an impeccable suit, entered looking around with studied interest. Even without seeing him for months, Richard would recognize Edward Matthews anywhere. "Good morning," greeted Edward, approaching the counter with a polite smile. "What a charming inn." Julia, not noticing Richard's sudden paleness, responded professionally. "Thank you. How can I help you?" "I hope you can," replied Edward, his eyes now fixed on Richard. "I'm looking for an old friend. I believe he might Be staying here." Before Julia could respond, Richard stepped forward. "Julia, why don't you check if the group needs anything for the coffee break? I'll attend to the gentleman." She hesitated, finally noticing the tension in the air, Richard's rigid posture, the intense look of the visitor. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," he replied, without taking his eyes off Edward. Reluctantly, Julia moved away, casting a last concerned look before entering the room where the group of executives was working. As soon as they were alone, Edward's smile widened but didn't reach his cold eyes. Richard, or should I say Andrew, what a charming scenario you found to hide. Very different from your old style, I must admit." "What do you want, Edward?" asked Richard, keeping his voice low, aware of the guests nearby. "Well, I came to see how my old partner is doing," replied Edward, feigning surprise. "After you disappeared so suddenly, I was worried. We all were." "I'm sure you were," replied Richard sarcastically, "especially after you set up that scheme to incriminate me." Edward laughed softly. "Always so dramatic." "I didn't set up anything, my friend. I merely reallocated some responsibilities, and it worked perfectly, didn't it? You're here, hiding in a little inn in the countryside while I manage what's left of our empire." "What's left? From what I heard, the stocks plummeted after the scandal." "A temporary setback," Edward shrugged. "But I didn't come to discuss business. I came with a proposal." Richard crossed his arms, suspicious. "What kind of proposal?" "Simple. I have documents that prove your active participation in certain questionable operations. Operations that you conveniently forgot when you decided to throw me to the wolves." "That's a lie. I never authorized the frauds you committed." "Perhaps not explicitly," conceded Edward. "But your signature is in enough places to make that distinction irrelevant to the authorities, unless, of course, those documents disappear." "And what do you want in exchange?" asked Richard, though he already suspected the answer. "Your share in the company, total and complete. You sign everything. Over to me, I destroy the evidence, and you can continue your idyllic new life with the innkeeper and her little children." The mention of Julia and the children sent a chill down Richard's spine. "You would leave them alone?" "Why wouldn't I?" Edward smiled coldly. "I have no interest in seaside inns or happy families. My business is money, Richard. Always has been. How do I know I can trust you?" "You don't," admitted Edward. "But what choice do you have? Your brother is trying hard, I must admit. But he won't find anything substantial in time to prevent me from completing what I started." At that moment, the door to the hall opened and Julia returned, followed by Michael. The teenager looked at Edward with obvious distrust. "Is everything okay here?" asked Julia, positioning herself protectively beside Richard. "Perfectly," replied Edward with his rehearsed smile. "Just reminiscing about old times with my friend and—" "Oops, Richard." Michael stepped forward, surprising everyone. "You're Edward," he said, not as a question but as an accusation. "The man who's trying to frame him." Edward raised his eyebrows, genuinely surprised. "I see the whole family is aware of the situation. Interesting." "I think you've said what you came to say," intervened Julia, with a firmness that impressed Richard. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have guests to attend to." Edward studied the woman in front of him with new interest. "Of course, I don't want to disrupt business. Richard, you have 48 hours to consider my proposal. I'm staying at the High Tide Hotel not far from here." With a last cold smile, he turned and left, leaving behind a heavy silence. "Was that him?" asked Julia as soon as the door closed. "Yes," confirmed Richard, feeling simultaneously exhausted and alert. "And he's not alone. Edward never goes anywhere without henchmen." "What did he want?" asked Michael, his voice firmer than Richard would expect from a teenager in such a situation. "He wants me to hand over my share in the company in exchange for destroying evidence against me," explained Richard, seeing little sense in hiding the truth now. "And will you accept?" asked Julia. "I don't know," he admitted. "Honestly, if it ensures your safety—" "No," interrupted Michael, surprising the adults again. "You can't do that. He's bluffing. If he had real evidence against you, he would have already turned it over to the police." Richard looked at the boy with admiration. "You're very insightful for your age." It's not insight, replied Michael. It's simple logic. And besides, he hesitated briefly, I read in your diary that you have some evidence against him too. Something about a flash drive hidden. Michael, exclaimed Julia, shocked by the invasion of privacy. It's okay, assured Richard. He's right. I have a flash drive with some emails and documents that incriminate Edward. Nothing conclusive, but enough to raise serious doubts. It's hidden in my brother's apartment. Then call your brother, suggested Michael, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Ask him to get the flash drive. Julia and Richard looked at each other, both impressed with the teenager's clarity of thought. It's not that simple, explained Richard. Edward is probably monitoring Robert. If my brother suddenly goes to my old apartment, what if someone else goes, suggested Julia. Someone Edward doesn't know or isn't monitoring. Like who? Julia's eyes sparkled with determination. Like me. No way. Richard's response was immediate and categorical. It's too dangerous, Julia. Edward has people watching my apartment, I'm sure. He must be watching obvious places, she argued. Your apartment, your office, maybe your brother's house. But no one will notice an unknown woman, a simple innkeeper from Bayshore. Mom, Michael seemed torn between admiration for his mother's courage and fear for what might happen. It's too risky, insisted Richard. I can't let you get involved in this. I'm already involved, replied Julia, with a determination that allowed no argument. The moment you walked through the door of my inn, the moment we decided to face this together, and I won't stand by, while that man tries to destroy what we're building. Richard stared at her, divided between pride in this woman's strength and terror at seeing her in danger because of him. We need a better plan, intervened Michael, surprisingly pragmatic. Going there without adequate preparation would be reckless. Julia and Richard looked at the teenager, momentarily disconcerted by his maturity. He's right, finally agreed Richard. We need to be strategic. At that moment, they were interrupted by one of the executives leaving the meeting room. Immediately, they resumed their professional postures, Julia asking if the group needed anything, Richard offering to call a taxi for some who wished to explore the town. Only much later, after dinner, when the guests had retired and Beatrice was already asleep, could they resume the conversation. Sitting on the inn's porch, with only the faint light of an old lantern, they discussed in low voices the possibilities. What if we enlisted your father's help, suggested Richard to Julia. He could stay with the children while we go to Chicago. We? She questioned, raising an eyebrow. If you insist on going, I won't let you go alone, he declared. We can trust Mr. Gerald to take care of the inn and the children for a day or two. And Robert? Asked Michael, who had joined them with his mother's reluctant permission. Couldn't he just send us the flash drive? Too risky, replied Richard. As I said, Edward is probably monitoring Robert's communications. Any suspicious movement would attract attention. Then we'll go to Chicago, decided Julia. Tomorrow, the corporate group is going on a boat excursion that will last all day. We can take the first bus, resolve this, and return the next day. And what will we tell Beatrice? Worried Michael. That we need to resolve some supplier details in Chicago for the inn, replied Julia. It's not exactly a lie. The plan took shape throughout the night. Robert would be notified through a code previously established between the brothers, an apparently casual message about a reunion of former students from the school where they studied. He would understand and provide the key to Richard's apartment, which would be hidden in a specific location in the law office. You've thought of everything, commented Michael, impressed. Years of complicated negotiations taught me to anticipate problems, explained Richard. Then, looking directly at the boy, he added, Michael, I need you to promise something important. What? If something goes wrong, if we don't return in the expected time, you should call this number. Richard wrote on a paper and handed it to the teenager. It's my brother's personal cell phone. Tell him exactly what happened. Michael nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation. I'll take care of Beth and Grandpa. You can trust me. We know we can, smiled Julia, hugging her son with pride. The next morning, after explaining the situation to Mr. Gerald, omitting the more dangerous details, and saying goodbye to a sleepy Beatrice who barely registered their departure, Richard and Julia boarded the first bus to Chicago. The approximately 4-hour journey was spent partly in tense silence, partly planning every detail of the operation. "What's your apartment like?" asked Julia at one point, trying to visualize the location of the flash drive. "Too big for one person," replied Richard with a self-deprecating smile. "Duplex penthouse in the Gold Coast neighborhood, view of Lake Michigan." "Wow," she laughed softly, "quite different from your room at the inn." "And much less cozy," he added, holding her hand. "I never really felt at home there." Upon arriving in Chicago, they took separate taxis to Robert's office, taking care not to be seen together in an environment where Richard could be recognized, even with the beard and dark glasses he now wore as a disguise. The Anderson Law firm occupied 2 floors of an elegant commercial building in the River North area. Julia entered first, introducing herself at reception as a potential client interested in business law. While waiting, she discreetly located the plant pot near the water fountain, where, according to the plan, the key to Richard's apartment would be hidden. 20 minutes later, using the excuse of needing a drink of water, she managed to retrieve the small envelope hidden between the pot and the wall. She thanked the receptionist, claimed she needed to verify some documents before scheduling a formal consultation, and left. Richard was waiting for her in a cafe 2 blocks away, anxious. "Did you get it?" he asked as soon as she sat at his table. "Mission accomplished," replied Julia, discreetly passing the envelope to him under the table. "And now?" "Now comes the hardest part," he said, tucking the envelope into the inner pocket of his jacket. Entering the apartment without being noticed, the building where Richard lived was one of the most luxurious constructions in the city, with rigorous security and doormen who would certainly recognize him despite the disguise. Therefore, they had planned to enter through the garage using the access key that was also in the envelope. A taxi dropped them off a block from the building. They walked separately, Richard a few meters ahead, Julia following him discreetly. When they reached the garage entrance, they waited for a car that was entering and, taking advantage of the moment when the gate was open, quickly slipped inside. "So far, so good," murmured Richard, as they walked rapidly among the parked luxury cars. "The service elevator is in that direction." They managed to reach the elevator unseen and went directly to the top floor. Julia's heart was beating fast, partly from fear, partly from the adrenaline of the situation, something completely different from her tranquil routine in Bayshore. Richard's apartment occupied the entire upper floor of the building. When they opened the door, Julia couldn't help but let out a gasp of admiration. It was spacious and decorated with elegant minimalism, designer furniture, contemporary artworks, huge glass windows revealing a panoramic view of the city. "You really left all this behind," she commented, looking around. "And I don't regret it one bit," he replied, holding her hand. "Let's go. The flash drive is hidden in the office." The office was an equally impressive room, with an entire wall of books, a dark wood desk, and a leather armchair that looked like it had never been used. Richard went directly to a small abstract sculpture on the desk, a bronze piece that, when manipulated correctly, revealed a secret compartment in its base. "Here it is," he said, triumphant, holding a small silver flash drive. "All the evidence we need against Edward." At that moment they heard a sound at the front door. Someone was entering the apartment. They exchanged alarmed looks. There was no time to flee or hide. The office door opened, and to their shock and relief, it was Robert who entered. "I figured you'd be here," said the lawyer, closing the door behind him. "You two need to learn to be more discreet. The doorman called me as soon as he identified Richard on the security cameras." "Robert," Richard briefly hugged his brother. "This is Julia." "The famous innkeeper," smiled Robert, extending his hand to her. "My brother talked a lot about you." "The pleasure is mine," replied Julia, impressed by the formality and elegance of the man before her, so different and yet so similar to Richard. "Did you get the flash drive?" asked Robert quickly, returning to the main subject. "Yes," Richard showed the device. Everything is here. The emails between Edward and those Asian investors, the documents with forged signatures, everything. Good, Robert nodded, satisfied. Because I have important news. One of Edward's collaborators decided to cooperate with us. He provided documents proving that Edward manipulated evidence against you. That's incredible, exclaimed Richard, feeling a wave of hope for the first time in months. It's still not enough to completely clear your name, warned Robert. But combined with what's on that flash drive, we can at least create reasonable doubt about the most serious accusations. And what about Edward? Asked Julia. He was at the inn yesterday, threatening Richard. Edward is playing his last bluff game, explained Robert. He knows we're gathering evidence. That's why he went to you, trying to pressure before he lost all advantage. And now, asked Richard, what's the next step? Now we go to the FBI, replied Robert, with the determination characteristic of the Anderson brothers. With this evidence, we can at least ensure you have a fair hearing instead of being automatically considered guilty. The prospect was both frightening and hopeful. It meant that Richard would have to come out of the shadows, publicly face the accusations, possibly go through a long legal process. But it also meant a chance to clear his name, to rebuild his life, not as the financial magnate he once was, but as the man he had become in Bayshore. Before we go, said Richard, taking Julia's hand, there's something important I need to get. He led her to the master bedroom, another spacious and elegant environment, dominated by a king-size bed never unmade. He opened the closet and, at the back, revealed a safe embedded in the wall. What is this? Asked Julia, confused. Not. Everything I have is invested in the company, he explained, typing the combination. I always kept personal reserves separate from the business. The safe opened, revealing several document folders, some bundles of money, and, to Julia's surprise, a small velvet box. This box has been here for years, said Richard, picking it up carefully. It was my grandmother's. She always said I should give it only to the woman I truly loved. Julia's heart raced when he opened the box, revealing a delicate gold ring with a single pearl surrounded by small diamonds. I know it's not the ideal moment nor the place, he continued, his voice choked with emotion, and I know we have a lot to resolve before we can think of any future together. But I want you to know, Julia, that you changed my life. You showed me what really matters. And if someday, after all this is over, you'll accept me, I want to build a life with you and your children. Tears shimmered in Julia's eyes. You choose the most unusual moments for important declarations, you know, she laughed through tears. First you tell me you're a fugitive after kissing me, and now you practically propose to me in the middle of a secret operation. Richard also laughed, relieved by her reaction. So is that a maybe? This is a let's survive this day first and then we'll talk about the future, she replied, but her eyes said much more. He put the box in his pocket along with some important documents from the safe, and together they returned to where Robert was waiting, already impatient. Can we go now? Asked the lawyer, checking his watch. We're ready, replied Richard with a new determination. The three left the apartment and went down to the garage where Robert's car awaited them. They were about to get in when they were surprised by Edward, accompanied by two men of intimidating appearance. I knew I'd find you here, said Edward with a cold smile. Always so predictable, Richard. It's over, Edward, replied Richard, positioning himself protectively in front of Julia. We have all the evidence. Your manipulations, the forged signatures, everything. Evidence? Edward laughed, but there was nervousness in his gaze. What evidence? Your word against mine? A desperate fugitive trying to save his skin? It's not just his word, intervened Robert. We have witnesses, documents, emails. Your own assistant is cooperating with us. The mention of the assistant made Edward visibly pale. He signaled to the two men who took a step forward, threatening. I don't think you're going anywhere with that flash drive, he said, extending his hand. It was at this moment that Julia surprised everyone. With a quick and precise movement, she grabbed the arm of the closest man, twisting it in a perfect arm lock and bringing him down to the ground. What the? Edward backed away, shocked. 7 years of self-defense classes, explained Julia, assuming a defensive stance. A single mother in a tourist town learns to protect herself. The second man hesitated, clearly reconsidering his options in light of Julia's demonstration of skill. Robert took advantage of the moment to pull out his cell phone. "The police are on their way," he announced, "and I suggest you don't try anything stupid, Edward. We've already sent copies of all the evidence to several trusted contacts. Even if you get the flash drive now, it's too late." Edward looked around, realizing he had lost control of the situation. His face, normally composed, was contorting in a mixture of anger and desperation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice now almost pleading. "I built that company as much as you did, Richard. I deserved more than always being the second in command, always in your shadow." "That doesn't justify what you did," replied Richard. "Forging documents, manipulating the market, threatening innocent people." "It was the only way," shouted Edward, completely losing his composure. "You would never give me the recognition I deserved." The sound of approaching sirens ended the discussion. Edward, realizing he was cornered, made one last desperate attempt to grab the flash drive, but was quickly immobilized by Robert and Richard. Minutes later, the garage was filled with FBI agents. Edward and his men were detained, while Richard, Julia, and Robert were escorted to give formal statements. The following hours passed in a blur of testimonies, declarations, preliminary analyses of the evidence. Robert, using all his influence and legal skill, managed to negotiate favorable conditions for Richard. He would have to answer to the process while free, regularly attending hearings, but would not be preventively detained. It was already night when they were finally released. Exhausted but relieved, they returned to Robert's office to discuss the next steps. "It's going to be a long process," warned the lawyer. "The evidence is strong in our favor, but the judicial system is slow." "How long?" asked Julia, concerned. "Months. Maybe a year or more until a definitive resolution," replied Robert honestly. "But the important thing is that Richard is no longer running. He can rebuild his life while we face this." "And the company?" asked Richard. "With Edward detained and the accusations against you being questioned, the stocks have already begun to recover," explained Robert. "But honestly, after all this, do you still want to go back to that life?" Richard looked at Julia, who was observing him with a mixture of affection and expectation. The answer came easily. "No, that life is over for me. I want to build something, something with real meaning." "Like an inn in Bayshore?" smiled Robert. "Exactly," confirmed Richard, "with the woman I love and a family I've learned to value more than any fortune." Julia squeezed his hand,